Hello, I'm Kyle Brown, and I'm a senior concept artist working in film, television, and games. In Volume 1, we set up the foundation of all of our designs, including silhouette, exploration, and line and value. Now, as we move into Volume 2, we're going to explore color options and ideation, getting the proper material read of all the organic textures we choose, as well as selecting photographs to use as photo textures to implement in our designs to get what we consider a more photoreal finish on our conceptual designs. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. Awesome. Thanks for sticking around here and checking out this bonus chapter covering an additional topic that we didn't go over during the initial exercise, and that is adding costume slash armor and weaponry to your creature. So the point of this process is we've been describing a character, or really a creature that is a character, has a bit of a personality to it, some intelligence to it. So we want to show that it isn't this wild beast. There's some semblance of intelligence. So it uses some props, some weaponry, and it dresses itself in some clothing slash armor to protect itself. This is a great way to tell additional story, to convey more character on your design. And to me, once you have the initial creature blocked out, it's this fun additional layer that you can work up alongside your design to get even, further iterations out. So nothing too fancy about this stage, very similar to how we started our character initially, but rather than the kind of chunky blue brush, I've opted to use what kind of feels like a black liner pen, or a micron pen. But still digitally, but what it allows me to do is just get much more precise shapes. Luckily, so much of the framework of this creature, all the hard work we did at the onset of the design, setting up the perspective and the volume of the creature, serves as the groundwork for the armor itself. So, when I'm establishing this armor and, getting, like, say, the cuts in the plates or, the leather straps, they will serve as form lines that help just reinforce the directionality of those shapes, the form as a whole. So that's the biggest thing, and one of the most, prevalent pitfalls that I see in design is where the costume doesn't feel like it's actually wrapping around or contouring the shape that it's sitting on top of. So it's you have to be very deliberate with where you're putting those lines and making sure that these areas that you're dressing feel like they're actually enveloping or sitting on top of this creature. So I'm keeping it very simple at this stage. You can decide to block out individual components on separate layers, but here I've just opted to put all the armor on one layer, and here I am just blocking out the solid silhouette or the base value underneath my armor in this orange. It's not going to be this orange color at the end, but this is just so my eye can quickly identify where I've painted, where I haven't. It's very similar to, you know, the flatting process in comic book illustration, or for those of you that work in 3D and utilize clown passes, or, you know, material ID passes. You can do that and then grab selections from that. But this is more just so I can have a very clean silhouette to work with as I paint in, because it's going to be a very organic, fluid process. You know, this is meant to be, you know, a very quick design at the end of the day that I can tack on to help sell the character that much more, but isn't connected to the creature directly, meaning the two are independent of one another and can be displayed as such. So I'm just checking my values here real quick, and now I'm going to actually desaturate it, and I'm opting for not like a completely gray, but this kind of warmish gray hue to serve as the base to this warm metal that I'm going to opt for. And I really do like rendering this way sometimes, where it's based off of the principle understanding that we talked about at the very beginning of the workshop, especially volume 1, just describing form very quickly. I have a multiply layer set on top, or clipped to, using a clipping mask, clipped to that base layer, and just going in and rendering out some of the shadows. You could do this with an overlay layer as well if you'd like to, you know, handle both your shadows and your highlights on the same layer. But this is a little bit more of an organic process, and with it being the metal, I can go in here and just quickly block out these forms. Now, this isn't going to be the final rendering, because we'll talk about you know, going in and breaking up some of this lighting information to get more of a naturalistic feeling, to actually have it look like the material I'm trying to render. And we're going to get some separation, especially like here on you know, on this sort of center pouch or loincloth element. You know, that's going to be more of like a leather material versus the metal that I'm rendering elsewhere. So you can see, like, even just taking the hard round brush and smushing it down to get more of an elliptical, or an ellipses, gives me just a little bit more of texture to it. I can actually start to get some chunkier brush strokes out of it, and defining this sort of imperfect surface that would come along with like a hammered metal feeling. And to me, the reason why I can go through and do this at a relatively quick pace is because so much of the lighting information is already established by the creature that we've been rendering up to this point. You know, I have the direction of the lighting. I understand the way that the forms are described. So obviously this all has to sit on top of that, and that will dictate where the lights and shadows are, and where cast shadows fall across the surface. So here as well, I'm just going in with the smudge tool and just kind of breaking up some of those surfaces. Now I want to describe some of the secondary forms in terms of the leather straps. And I did that by just locking the active pixels, so I could just quickly block in over what was already established and get that break up. And two, I'm thinking about the harmony here of the material, or the choice of material and the color. You can either contrast it by doing something extreme, getting that breakup between what the material is and what the creature itself is, or you can harmonize it a bit more. And I want this to feel like almost like a science fiction orc or goblin, that's this almost predator-esque creature, so they're more naturalistic materials. So even like they're going in with this red loincloth, I'll just quickly wash over some different natural tones to get that breakup, just in an opaque hue. I'm not worried about it being too precise. Even here with the metal, I'm washing in some blues, washing in some warmer tints, just to get those variations in this imperfect surface. So I can always continue to render more on top, but to me, it's just, I want to get those chromatic shifts in it that give it that natural flair. Now in an overlay layer, I'm just going in, embellishing, same thing, very rough in the approach here, kind of using a brush stroke back and forth to get this kind of chiseled aesthetic, this hammered metal, to show that it is an imperfect surface, and I want to contrast that against the skin underneath it. But this is fun because you can just go in here, kind of not turn your brain off. It's still you have to be an active participant in your work. But if you feel like, you've got the roadmap here, then you just kind of have to drive. How many other analogies can I come up with? But you get the gist. You just kind of roll with it. Even at this stage, just keeping it to a minimal amount of layers. Now, based on what we discussed very early on about materials, and we didn't really have anything like this on the creature itself, but we have a metal with a little bit of a higher specularity, a little bit more of a reflective quality. So I'm going through and just picking up a little bit more of the bounce light, and it can get intricate here, getting the light of the shoulder pauldron, or excuse me, the reflectivity of the light bouncing off, say, the breastplate back onto the shoulder pauldron, a deeper, richer core shadow there, and then a much richer, brighter highlight from our light source. If you ever have any questions about this, just grab some photo reference of the material you're trying to emulate. It may or may not be the exact lighting scenario you have in mind, but it's going to give you a lot of information on what it should look like, or the way that light and shadow are interacting on the surface. So here I just did just like a merge down. Everything's opaque now, very similar to the way that I tackled the creature as a whole. So I'd eventually at a point just do a merge down and start to paint opaquely into it. And the thing is here, there is already an aesthetic established by the creature itself. There are some graphic elements, but for the most part, line has all but been removed. So the fact that I had line in this rough sort of sketch for the armor, I basically lowered the opacity of the armor, that kind of rough outline or construction of that, lowered it down into the painting I had done, and just collapsed them. So now I can kind of paint over it, paint into it, because that's often a question that comes up with students that want to maintain more of a painterly aesthetic in their work, even though we set up the construction with line. And ultimately you can just work it where you just diminish the line art more and more as you paint up, so you can turn it on and off, and if your values are still holding up without your line work being on, then you're getting closer there. And so you can see right at the top of that shoulder pauldron, I started to do kind of that neck protection plate, but because the anatomy is a little bit different than what we consider like a traditional medieval knight or a jouster, there's really no need for that plate to be up there near the back. So I'm just doing this little elevated planar shift in the plate, just to show the dimensionality there, show it's curving around the back. So this is the benefit of having all of the lighting information established already, because as I start to paint opaquely into it, everything's there. Everything's blocked out, so then I can just color pick and blend between those, make decisions as need be, because at the end of the day, it's a 2D design that I have to make read appropriately. So if that means cheating something a little bit more to get an appropriate read, is it technically correct? Maybe not, but if it gives me the correct read, then that's really what matters. So as you can see here, even though I've knocked these values back, I've all but removed the high sheen, the specular sheen of that armor. So, right now it's even giving me a different material read than the shoulder pauldron. So it could look like it's composited of different materials, or in this case, I can go back in, color pick, bring that highlight back in, and then just wash that back into it. So I just wanted to knock back the values as a whole and then bring the highlight back into it. There's a lot of theory that goes into, dressing your characters and your creatures, especially with, organic alien life forms that come from another planet. And when you're trying to establish, a design language for something that's supposed to feel alien and from beyond Earth, it can be a little tricky to come up with something that feels relatable to the audience, but has, maybe a function that we don't really understand, or it does have an Earth-like function, but it's meant to look like something completely exotic. That's why I just, for something like this, I look at cultures from all around our own planet to serve as an inspiration into the design language I choose here. And not being afraid to choose some things that are more ornamental and then kind of reverse engineering it so it may feel more functional. I do that a lot with sci-fi work, and that's what I really enjoy doing the most. Is science fiction. But if I can blend something else into it, if I'm in a mood to explore something, where I feel like maybe Art Nouveau might look really cool in a science fiction piece, I'll bring in some more floral elements, or if, say, Art Deco will work better and that kind of constructive, angular aesthetic from, that movement would look better, then I'll bring that in. In this case, I thought, well, it's maybe something a little bit more primitive, but have a material that feels a tad bit more medieval. Have some leather straps, binding everything together, but just give it that little extra touch that starts to feel a little bit more alien or exotic, very similar to the way that the Predator is approached. But there's just such a vast array of cultural influence on our own planet that if you take a deep dive and really scour books and the internet and documentaries, you can find some really beautiful design language and just textural details and color breakdowns and I don't know, concepts and ideas that you can infuse into your own work that pay homage to great cultures that make up our planet. So there's just such a diverse collection that can go into helping rectify things or shining a light on things that may not be known otherwise. So saving here. So here's important. I'm working underneath the armor with a multiply layer and just getting like the cast shadow. So the sort of length, or what we consider maybe the depth of these shadows, is going to describe how far away these plates are from the surface. The smaller the shadow, it describes a object or a part of costuming that is much closer to the skin. In the case like the shoulder pauldron, I wanted to show that some raised areas were further away from the bicep there, so we get a much wider cast shadow. But just thinking about where that light source is and mapping that out, and not only making sure that the shape is correct, but making sure that it actually curves along that form it's washing across as well. So now I'm going back to this good old bevel and emboss aesthetic again, or utilizing the FX tools to do the inverse of the scar effect that we did previously. So now I actually want to use it like a bevel emboss to get some design language on the armor, to play around with just a slight indication of some alien language, or almost like hieroglyphics or something built into the design that shows a little bit more of a cultural aspect. Because when you're thinking about armor and stuff, like, first and foremost, it serves a purpose. So that's the rudimentary aspect to armor. It's protection. But then as society advances, then once something is honed or a skill is honed in on, or they understand a certain practice, then things get more ornate. They can work on their craft, and that's what I love, the storytelling element here, in designs like this, where you can show whether it's part of a clan, it's part of an organization, or a specific, group or species, to say, well, this is the thing that unifies them. It's not just some mindless brood. It's part of a collective, but there is this unifying force. So even quickly here, just, establishing an iconography that can be duplicated throughout the design, but also gives us some shape language that can be repeated throughout. So we have a lot of curved shapes, so I'm trying to break that up with some more angular designs, just to introduce some more contrast into design language. So here I wanted to apply, so an overlay layer does allow me to get brighter or darker, so I wanted to give some indents to show some battle bruises in the armor, to show where they'd been dented in and busted. So whether it took like a laser blast, or just blunt trauma to the armor here, whether it was attacked by a melee weapon, so there's just these little dings and dents. And then with that same layer, going in with just a brush with a little bit of tooth to it, a little bit of scattering, just to show that like kind of those divots and pivoting, or small variations in the surface to get that break up. So as I mentioned at the very beginning of this workshop, once we have the kind of specular read, we want to break up the surface to show there are those little variations in the surface that will give us the appropriate read. It just makes it feel a little bit more natural, less machined, less man-made. Just increasing that cast shadow along the or excuse me, that form shadow along the back of the form there. Even if not 100% correct, it's just draws the eye and makes sure that it gives it the appropriate read of the material. Because absolutely, we get some bounced light around there and back and stuff, but right now it's important that we get a material read, and I'm getting that contrast between what is metallic and what is the organic tissue of the creature itself. And two, there's a tendency to, if like we're using, if I'm using like these big giant brush strokes, it can often feel very soft. So what I'm trying to go through and do is just chisel out some of these edges, even if graphically, just to go back in and catch some of these rivets and divots in the surface with some sharper aggressive lines, some scratches, some edge highlights, just to get a little bit more of a breakup, just to make it feel like it's a bit sharper as it executes near the edge of the armor. Just makes it feel a little bit more dangerous. Prevents it from feeling overly soft. Now we have the contrast of a softer, material like a loincloth here, like a leather-esque material. And two, this is an example where it does serve you to render or bring these things up uniformly. So I fixated a lot on the armor up here on the shoulder pauldron, and this is where you might want to spend some time coming back in and resolving the other armor pieces if they're meant to be the same material, because sometimes when you're in the groove, you go through it and then you go, oh, I need to replicate that elsewhere. How did I go through that and stuff? So if you're going to have similar materials, it is really best to do that all at once. So here again, just see here on that plate around the shoulder there, just embellishing. So that loops around there, and you can see I'm just catching a little bit of that rim light on the back. So technically, not the same rim light. Well, I guess let me put it this way: it is the same rim light affecting the left side of the body. It's kind of wrapping around, and because it's so highly metallic, it's picking up a little bit of that light, or what we consider bounce light. But I'm diffusing it a little bit. I'm knocking it down a little bit so it doesn't have that same intensity that the actual rim light has. So it's more of a bounce light. So it's not, it doesn't feel like there's a two light setup behind it with a key light. So I wanted to chisel this out, and this was an idea to show kind of its welding skills too. I wanted to play around with the idea of forged metal, where they've been kind of stapled together. It's not the prettiest armor, or maybe it was at one point, but it's just been kind of forged together, welded back together. Using a very sharp brush to help just embellish these cut lines or these divots or separations in the plate, varying that up so it doesn't feel like design language. It just feels like broken armor. What's nice there, especially at this stage, I'm just I really want to just paint. So I'm color picking local values here, like you saw I did that little divot. So not a lot in terms of different blend modes or adjustments, just color pick and paint, because everything is set up to the point where if I'm consciously thinking about what I'm color picking, I should get something within the value range that works for what I need it to be. So that's the biggest thing, is contrasting big brush strokes against like sharper, more, angular, I shouldn't say angular, aggressive sharp lines there that can help just cut surfaces so everything doesn't feel like mush. You really want to tighten these details up. So it feels like the material you're trying to capture. We could be a little bit softer with the organic material of the creature. I want to be a little bit sharper here with this armor to really help sell the idea that this is not, well, quote unquote man-made, let's say creature-made, but it's still a manufactured, a made piece of equipment. So there I opted to get rid of that kind of articulation point, that ring there. So just opting for filling that in and divoting the metal a bit more, darkening up that leather strap, just getting some variation in the materials. So right there too, like showing the peak edge there, so really selling the idea that is curving or wrapping around that sort of, I guess we consider the pectoral plate or that upper torso plate. Really have to show the fact that leather strap is close to that surface and contouring around that armor. So by getting that shadow to line right up to and follow the form shadow on the metal goes a long way to describing what that's doing volumetrically. Where I don't have line, I can just go in and graphically get more separation between, or place more separation between these plates. So instead of line, it's more a graphic element of occlusion, light actually occluding in those cavities that just helps sell that separation a little bit more. And obviously the area of focus is still that upper torso, so I'm spending more time there. A lot of this stuff will fall into shadow, and with purpose too. It's kind of easy to hide some of these points, but to me, I don't need them to be an area of focus. Like this leather strap or little protective area over the oblique or the serratus there on the side underneath the bicep. It doesn't necessarily need to be all that well described at this point. To me, I'd rather show off the design language of this upper torso plate. And this part of the process can definitely get more noodly. So, and to me, when you're this far into a project, it might you might start getting a little tired on it. Just even if it's mentally tired, you've exhausted a lot of effort on just getting things blocked out. So for me, I try my best to just step back for a second and start to think about this as this whole new design. Yes, it's on this creature that I've been working on. Yes, it has to work, smoothly with what I've already established or what I'm trying to think about as a design as a whole. But it's this element that is sitting on top. I can't have this be lesser than the piece as a whole, because it will detract from what I'm trying to achieve, and it can fall apart. So, all right. So what I want to do on this shoulder pauldron is emulate kind of this scorched metal, or this heated metal. And even though this isn't like an area where flame is emitting from, I want to show that it's been spot welded at maybe a hot temperature, and it kind of burnt the metal and kind of oxidized here. So rather than going through maybe like a patina or something like that, or rusting, I just wanted to show that it's still relatively clean, but just getting some of those cool hues in there just to shift it a little bit differently, to show that maybe they have a weapon that can or a device that can just quickly sort of piece those things together and slap them back on and get back into the thick of things. And you'll notice too that my brush is actually set to overlay. So you can set your brush to a specific blend mode rather than having your layer set to it. And not that I necessarily recommend working that way all the time. Typically it's set to normal. The crazy thing is you can have a brush set to, like, say, multiply, but your layer itself can be set to overlay, and you can get some, interesting results, but it might be a little bit harder to control. To me, when I'm nearing the end here and I'm working opaquely, or alla prima on one layer, I will opt to just change the blend mode of a specific brush rather than the layer as a whole. Especially for something like that with the heated metal, where I just want to quickly wash in some color without changing the layer type as a whole or adding a whole other layer. It just keeps it a little bit more fluid, a little bit more of an organic process as a whole. Now, part of this is, establishing the design, the look, and the feel of this gauntlet piece, and making sure that it fits along with the form language of the rest of the armor. If you want something to feel cobbled together, like it's a collection of different pieces that don't belong, like it's a pirate or something, like its gear is assembled out of collected pieces, then that's one thing. And then you really want to push that to make sure that it feels very deliberate. Otherwise, it should feel cohesive, as though there's an organization to the way these elements are arranged or dressed on the character. So even if maybe the hue of the metal changes a little bit, or the material of the metal tweaks a little bit more, like for instance here on this lower foot plate on the right foot, there's some asymmetry to it to show that this isn't like a military issued uniform or armor. It is sort of cobbled together in the sense that it is asymmetrical all the way up and throughout the body, but the material might be slightly different. Maybe this has more of a warmer tint to it, but the cut lines are meant to emulate the design language of the upper torso. So we have that unifying factor. So even if the material itself reads a little bit differently, there has to be a cohesive design language then, whether it's that same iconography from the shoulder pad, those kind of angular shapes, or the dings and rivets or cut lines, like all that stuff would have to, or should, I should say, be similar to one another to unify the piece and just make it feel that much more cohesive. And as well, I don't necessarily, because it is that the same sort of sheen, the same metal as the upper torso. I don't want to hit it with the exact same values that we see on the upper torso that's actually illuminated by our light source. That's usually a pitfall of the design work I see, where every material is treated exactly the same throughout the piece, regardless of the light source. So to me, I want to guide the eye, and if all of a sudden I start hitting this with like a really high sheen or specularity, it's going to detract from that upper torso. So I'm going to hit it with a little bit, but even as you can see, my highlight, like if you were to look over at my color wheel, we're at about a 20% gray with just a few hits of white to get that sheen there, which of course are at the top of the plate and or on the lip, I should say, underneath the cut line. And even if I'm selecting white here, I'm very with a very low pressure sensitivity, painting it in. So I really don't want it to detract or compete with the values that I already have established up in the upper torso. That's interacting with our primary light source there. It's all about guiding the viewer's eye. So very simple trick here, just grabbing the lasso tool, color picking from the metal, from that shoulder pauldron, and using the lasso to just get a sharp angular line. Like with the sword here, I want this to read as a very aggressive weapon. And this is just kind of quick and dirty. If I spend a little bit more time on it, maybe come up with something a little bit more original. For me, this is pretty standard, and usually the first ideas out the gate are repetitious. They are almost regurgitated from things you've done before, seen before. So can't say that a wrist blade is the most unique sort of weapon for an alien creature here, but want to try something a little different to have it feel almost more like a broadsword, and with these prongs, these pieces that come out the side that almost have a Batman like aesthetic. Just something a little bit different, and we're going to play around with this a bit more here just to see if there's something else we can come up with. Just going around too and just adding some tertiary details, like some buckles and things, just so there's some more visual interest. And here's some reference I just wanted to spotlight that I had on my reference board off the side. I decided I wanted to make it this heated metal. Like this was a reoccurring thing. Like if it had this heated technology to heal its armor, maybe it's the type of weapon that is used to cut through the armor. So maybe that's part of the storytelling element, is that, maybe it battled a brother in arms or someone using a very similar technology, hence why the armor has that the sort of heat marks around those cut lines rather than just a normal cut. So maybe they have a ignited blade, or just a super high temperature blade that can kind of cut these materials. And to me, at this stage, it doesn't really it really doesn't have to do with blend modes or anything technical. Whatever gets you the desired effect is the way it works. So, for me here, you might want to wash a color in, but it's about observation, because we might have the darkness of the blade, but then almost a semi-translucency as the blade heats up and is ignited. So it's really about observing the materials you're trying to emulate and show, there's this kind of hot core to the side, and as we get to the exterior edge, might get a little bit darker, so it almost feels like it's illuminated from within, and then cools near the tip there, or near where the attachment to the wrist, not the tip is the hottest point here. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but I'm using just the hotkey R to rotate the canvas. It's an invaluable tool when you're working on an illustration. Constantly just rotate around and get the best angle to get whatever shape you're looking for. But ultimately, it comes down to observation here, and you can see I'm on a normal layer with a normal brush, just painting opaquely based on the reference that I've gathered. So don't go it alone is basically, long story short. Don't go it alone. Find reference that helps support the idea that you're trying to emulate. I promise you, even if you think you've really got it, there are little things, details that only through observing it can you really get or lock down, and it shows in the final piece. It really does. For a long time, self-admittedly, I feel like I'd go it alone, or I'd say, okay, cool, I got it, and then kind of leave it to the side, and ultimately the pieces suffered for it. I found that if I used the reference and emulated the color information I got, the lighting information, the textural information, it just helped the piece that much more. So it was a roadmap to success, and there's really no other ways to put it. The reference really is key. And I think the reason why I'm spending the time here is because obviously it's a dominant feature on the design. But now, we're at contrasting points. We're at the lower point of the frame here. I don't necessarily want it to compete with the head. So I'm playing around different value schemes, different sort of rendering finishes here to make sure it feels like it flows in tandem with the design as a whole, but it doesn't compete with the other parts of the design. So I'm constantly thinking about, how is the eye of the viewer going to, weave throughout the piece as a whole to make sure it feels coherent, but nothing, distracts from the overall idea. Too, I had some cutouts there, so I'm just kind of shoring up some of those edges. I don't want it to feel too battle bruised, like I said, or like too hammered. I still wanted it to feel like there is, some semblance of technology behind the gear they're using, even though they're using melee weapons. So you can see some speckling in the heated up metal. And this is the cool thing. Like, essentially it comes down to two layers. We have the armor, every, element that goes in the costuming, and then simply the cast shadows underneath it. And I'm just kind of playing up some of the bounce light here from the light illuminating. So it is an emissive light source here. So it is glowing. So that's independent of our light source on our creature as a whole. So I want to think about the way that this ignited blade is going to light the surrounding elements, whether it's the sword itself or the rest of the creature here. So just using a custom brush here with a little bit of tooth, that same kind of scattering brush I was using on the upper shoulder pauldron, and then just this chalkier brush, just to get some breakup within it, to show that the metal is not heating up evenly There is a random nature to it. It feels brutal. And two, getting a nice blend from the gauntlet down into the blade, so it feels like one cohesive material that then is heating up. So the audience should understand, what's going on there. And that's to say that if that isn't communicated, or whoever observes this piece and does not understand that, that's not a failure on the it's not a failure on the audience's part. That's on us, the designer. So I'm just using color dodge layer to ignite that just that much more, giving it a base black value so that I can plus up this value so it doesn't blow up, and just hang it orange. That just gives it that little bit more of that illumination, and a little bit. And two, by overspraying over the blade, you just get that pseudo light bloom around the surface as a whole. So I'm not afraid to let it just kind of ignite a little bit past that blade to show that it's illuminating the air and the dust particles around this guy. Now just playing a little bit of the bounce light there on the calf, to show that these are not individualized components, right? They all interact with one another, and that just helps sell the believability of the design. But just using it sparingly. So off on, you guys really can't see it here, but I'm gathering some additional photo texture details. So I just found some fire embers. And I'm just going to overlay that on top, just show that, maybe this was just pulled out of the fire. So it's like molten steel or something. And just a little bit of that. It goes such a long way to just helping describe I guess the information, the character as a whole, just the action. So I really enjoy doing that. And now I'm just, finding some leather reference to bring in for the loincloth here. Because even though it's rendered, I guess what I should say, it's rendered enough, but there's some nice, little... there's some details here, some nice little details in the wrinkles and the folds that you're just not going to get otherwise. So even if it's slight, just want to bring that information in and work that into what's already established. Just helps sell it that much more. No matter how good of a painter you are, there are always going to be those little variations in the surface and those little value breakups and inconsistencies that just bring life to a piece. So... here you can see as an example. I mean, I'm leaving it on, mostly just normal for the most part, and just playing around with the brightness contrast, and then just feather it in and out using the mask so that it's working in tandem with what's already established. But I want to keep a lot of that lighting information from the texture I just brought in. And sometimes too with costume, it may or may not be the most accurate draping. It should. I mean, you should really try your hardest to and light it appropriately. But sometimes it's just material ID. It's material identification. So if this were something for either a look dev artist to take and model, obviously a character artist to model, and then look dev to texture it and make it look like the correct material, or if it goes practical. For a costume department to actually fabricate, it should be there. It should read in the material that you're trying to convey. So as you see, as I shrink to almost that thumbnail size, I'm starting to just take in the image as a whole, make sure that everything is working together. Probably just do a little bit of post-processing on the end because there were some adjustments on the final design. So be careful with that too. If, say, as showed you guys at the final point on the wrap up of this creature at the end of the workshop, we did some post-processing effect, use some color LUTs to adjust everything. You either want to make sure you run it through that same process just on the armor, or turn those adjustments off and kind of reprocess everything together to harmonize it. Otherwise you're going to have the costuming and armor and weaponry on a separate layer that doesn't feel like it's cohesive with the rest of the piece. So you either want to reprocess it all together and call it, or take it off altogether. So even like that little highlight there on that pouch just gives a little bit more dimensionality. So just show there's something utilitarian about this. Like there's just a little bit more culture. Shoring up some of these details that just felt ill-defined at that point. Because it's the tricky thing too, and as you polish more areas and leave more unresolved, it just unfortunately shines a light on those unresolved areas. So it's all about that balance. You know, can you get away with areas that feel a little bit sketchier, a little bit looser, if you have areas that are more polished, so long as they're the right areas or the more dominant areas? Possibly, you know, it's to each their own, and it's all about communicating the idea. So you just kind of have to play around with it. But for me, everything was so polished. You know, you had elements on the lower legs, and the upper torso, you know, and the upper torso. So then you have the abdominal area here, and that feels like the least defined part. So your eye's going to jump over that as you work throughout the piece, and that won't work. So it just needed a little bit more tightening up. So I'm just collected everything, performed another unsharpened mask, which was probably duplicate of what had been done already. So you got to be careful of overdoing at that stage, but then just using camera raw filters to just harmonize everything collectively. So it just kind of color tints it so it all looks roughly about the same, using the lens correction to get a little bit of that chromatic aberration, as well as some vignetting just to darken those edges a little bit more, and then one last value check just to make sure everything is looking good. So that'll about do it. So one last value check, and here are the final design. So here is the creature as a whole, and now with the armor. So this is a nice way to show clients the underlying biological structure of the creature, as well as options for the adornments, the costume, the armor, the weaponry that's going to go on top of it, and to show that you have thought about the structure underneath. So once again, thank you so much for checking out Intro to Creature Design Volume 2. I hope you enjoyed everything we went through today. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you next time.